A dog. Chained. Auction labeled too dangerous to live. Every adult stepped back. One 8-year-old girl stepped forward. June 3, 2021, Willow Creek, Texas. 32 a.m. The auctioneer's words echoed across that lawn, "Do not approach this animal." The crowd obeyed. She didn't. But nobody warned her what June 3rd would cost her. 5 years later. Same date. Same dog. But this time a burning building. Trapped children. Thick black smoke. No way out. And buried inside that fire. A secret so precise, so impossible, connecting a boy who started the blaze, a dog who disappeared into flames years earlier, and a girl who had been carrying their story around her neck every single day without knowing it. This isn't just a story about survival. This is what loyalty looks like when it refuses to die. Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The morning of June 3, 2021, arrived with heat that pressed down on everything and refused to let go. By 10:32 a.m., the Brookfield Estate auction lawn in Willow Creek, Texas, was thick with the kind of crowd that forms when small-town curiosity meets a yard full of things left behind by the dead. Auctioneer Daniel Crow stood at his microphone with the easy confidence of a man who had been doing this job for 30 years, his voice carrying across the dry lawn without effort. Folding chairs sat in uneven rows. People fanned themselves with their bidding paddles and spoke in low voices. Most had come for the furniture, the old tools, the china cabinets. None had come expecting the moment that was about to happen. The German Shepherd was brought out on a heavy chain, held by two handlers who kept well back, each gripping a separate lead as though distance alone prevented catastrophe. The dog's name was printed on the auction board in plain black letters: Ranger. He was large and barrel-chested, his coat the color of dark smoke layered over amber, and his eyes moved across the crowd with a slow, measuring sweep that was not aggression but assessment. Daniel Crow did not pause to consider the difference. He leaned into the microphone and announced that Ranger was the most dangerous and untamable animal ever to pass through the Brookfield estate, that he had attacked without provocation, that no reasonable person would take a chance on him. The crowd laughed nervously and stepped back together in a single movement. 8-year-old Lily Miller did not step back. She stood at the edge of the crowd, sneakers pressed into dry grass, watching only the dog. In Ranger's eyes she saw pain wearing armor, the same look she had seen in 2018 in the smoke-filled hills of Paradise, California, in a rescue dog named Blaze. Blaze had pulled her from a burning room and then walked back into the flames. They never found him. They had called him dangerous once, too. Lily took her first step forward. Ranger's growl was low and unbroken, vibrating up through the chain the way a current runs through a wire, steady, contained, and impossible to ignore. The two handlers exchanged a glance and tightened their grip. Daniel Crow was still talking at the microphone, his voice riding the crowd's nervous energy, working the moment for everything it was worth. But Lily had stopped hearing him entirely. She moved forward through the open space that fear had cleared, her arms loose at her sides, her chin slightly lowered, not in submission, just in calm. She was 8 years old and small for her age, and she walked toward a dog that everyone else had already decided was beyond reaching, as simply and steadily as if she were crossing a room to sit beside a friend. The crowd went quiet the way crowds go quiet when a child does something that adults cannot immediately explain. A sudden, collective holding of breath that is partly astonishment and partly something closer to shame. She stopped just outside arm's reach and crouched so that her eyes were level with Ranger's. The growl dropped half a note. She did not reach out her hand. She did not use the bright, coaxing voice adults typically aim at frightened animals. She simply leaned slightly forward and said, in barely more than a whisper, "It's okay. I'm not scared of you." It was a small and unremarkable thing to say, and yet Ranger's ears, which had been pinned tight against his skull, shifted, just fractionally. Just enough. The way a door moves when the latch finally releases. What no one standing on that lawn knew at that moment, what most of them would only learn days later, when the full story moved from house to house across Willow Creek and eventually into every county newspaper, was that Ranger had not attacked without cause. 3 weeks earlier, on the back porch of the Brookfield property, a woman named Emily Carter had been confronted by her abusive ex-husband. He had grabbed her arm and twisted it, and she had cried out. Ranger had been loose in the yard. He did what dogs do when someone they are bonded to is being hurt. He placed himself squarely between Emily and the man and held that position until the man backed away and left the property. Emily had moved out of town shortly after. Overwhelmed and frightened, without the space or steadiness needed to explain what had really happened before the rumors had already taken the shape they preferred, Ranger had been seized, formally labeled dangerous, and scheduled for auction. Not one person had thought to ask Emily for her account of the night in question. Lily knew none of this as she crouched in front of him. She only knew what she saw. When Ranger finally lowered his head and rested his muzzle against her small open palm, the sound he made was not a growl. It was a long, exhausted exhale, the kind that comes out of a person who has been holding tension in their chest for weeks and is finally, for the first time, permitted to release it. Daniel Krause stood motionless at the microphone for perhaps the first time in 30 years of conducting auctions. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman pressed her fingers to her mouth without fully understanding why, and a town that had been entirely certain of its judgment stood in the quiet, uncomfortable discovery that it had been completely wrong. 5 years moved through the Miller household with the steadiness of good seasons. Ranger came home with Lily that same afternoon, riding in the back seat with his head resting across her knees, and in the years that followed he became as woven into the fabric of daily life as the worn patch of carpet at the foot of the stairs or the smell of coffee drifting through the house every morning. He learned the particular pitch of Lily's alarm clock and began appearing at her bedroom door at 6:47 every school day, a few minutes before it rang. He learned that she was afraid of sirens, not merely startled by them the way most people are, but genuinely, physically afraid. The kind of fear that originates deep in the chest and radiates outward until the hands tremble and the breath becomes thin and shallow. And on those days when a fire truck bellowed down their street or an ambulance wailed past the window, Ranger would press the full weight of his body against her legs without being asked and remain there, solid and warm and still, until the sound had faded completely out of hearing. He never needed to be told. He simply understood. Lily grew in the quiet, inward way that children grow when they have seen something at an early age that they cannot fully translate into words for anyone who wasn't there. She kept a photograph of Blaze in the drawer of her nightstand, a blurry image taken by a firefighter in the aftermath of the Paradise Fire, showing a dark shape near a wall of orange flame, and she had worn a small medal around her neck since she was 9 years old, a plain disc engraved with 4 words, "He went back." She rarely spoke about Blaze in public. She didn't need to. Some losses don't live in the memory, they settle into the body, into posture and instinct and the quiet way a person pauses when a certain sound reaches them from a distance. On the morning of June 3, 2026, Lily stood on the low stage of Cedar Ridge Elementary School's main auditorium, 13 years old, a stack of handwritten notes held carefully in both hands. The title printed at the top of the first page read, in her own careful lettering, "Compassion Before Judgment." She had written it over 2 weeks, revised it 4 times, and practiced it aloud in her bedroom until the words felt natural rather than performed. The auditorium held perhaps 300 people, students, parents, 2 rows of teachers along one wall, and her palms were damp against the paper and her voice, when she first began to speak, climbed slightly higher than her normal register, the way voices do when nerves press upward from the inside. By the second paragraph she had steadied. By the third she found her rhythm. She spoke about Ranger. She spoke about Blaze. She spoke about the auction lawn and the way a crowd of adults had moved backward as a single body because a man at a microphone had told them to be afraid before they had stopped to ask why. She was midway through a sentence about the cost of judgment when the smell arrived. It was faint at the edges at first, the sort of thing that registers somewhere below conscious thought, a sharpness beneath the stale air of the auditorium, something acrid and chemical that didn't belong. Then a boy in the back row stood up. Then 3 people at once. A door at the far end of the hall swung open, and a thin curl of gray smoke drifted through it, lazy and almost weightless. The way smoke moves in the early moments when the fire producing it is still small enough to make a person believe there is time. It did not stay thin. Within seconds the curl became a coil and the coil became a ribbon and the ribbon spread. A woman near the side exit made a sound that was not quite a scream, and then the alarm activated and the siren, that specific rising urgent wail that had lived somewhere behind Lily's sternum since 2018, tore through the building and through her body simultaneously. Before the echo of it had finished, a voice from somewhere near the back doors cut through the noise with 3 words that reorganized everything. "Emma is still inside!" The auditorium came apart in the frantic, uncoordinated way that enclosed spaces always do when panic is introduced into them without warning. Students pushed toward the exits in surging waves, chairs scraped hard across the floor, someone's bag caught a folding table and brought it down with a sharp clang that no one turned to look at. Teachers raised their voices above the alarm and tried to direct the flow of bodies toward the main doors, and most of the students followed because following was the thing to do, and because the fear in the room had a direction, and that direction was out. Lily stood at the podium for 3 seconds exactly. She counted them without meaning to. In those 3 seconds, something passed through her that she would not find the right words for until years later, not the paralysis she had expected, not the clean, simple bravery she had imagined bravery would feel like, but something in between those 2 things, a suspended instant in which the fear she had carried since she was 8 years old rose up and presented itself directly to her, and she looked at it fully, and it did not make her turn around. Images arrived without invitation blaze against an orange sky, turning back toward the flames. Ranger on the auction lawn, head low, eyes full of something everyone had decided was danger. The small flat metal pressing against her collarbone. He went back. She stepped down from the stage. The smoke entering from the east corridor had thickened from a thin ribbon into a genuine gray layer filling the upper third of the hallway, and Lily moved toward it rather than away from it, and the fundamental wrongness of that direction hit her body with a physical force. Her lungs wanted air, her legs wanted the exit. Every instinct she had accumulated across 13 years of ordinary life was pointing toward the doors that everyone else was already moving through. She kept walking. Ranger was where she had left him before the speech, tied to the old iron radiator hook at the base of the east corridor wall. Dogs were technically not permitted inside the building, but Cedar Ridge's principal had stopped raising that particular objection where Ranger was involved. Sometime around the 2nd year, he was on his feet, chain pulled taut, nose directed without deviation down the smoke-filled corridor. He turned his head and looked at her once. It was a single, unambiguous look, not a question, not a plea, but a statement of direction. Then he turned back toward the hallway. She unclipped his chain and called Emma's name, and her voice sounded strange in the smoke, flattened and too close, the way voices become when the air around them has changed its composition. Ranger dropped low immediately and moved ahead of her, his nose working in short, rapid sweeps across the floor. The ceiling above them had darkened in color, and the smoke smell had shifted from something acrid into something heavier, the smell of material burning rather than just heating. Lily pulled the collar of her blazer across her nose and followed. At the junction of the science wing, Ranger turned right without pause, tracking something she could not smell or hear. She had learned, over 5 years, that his certainty in moments like this was worth more than her doubt. The science lab door was half open. Inside, Emma Rise was on the floor beside her overturned wheelchair, both palms pressed flat against the linoleum, coughing hard into her arm. A collapsed shelf unit had tipped across the doorway during the alarm's initial noise, a small, stupid, ordinary piece of bad luck that had taken a clear exit and turned it into a wall. Emma looked up as Lily pushed through the door, and the expression on her face was rawer than simple relief. It was the expression of a person who had stopped believing rescue was possible, and was now confronted with the fact of it. "I couldn't get the chair through," she said, and her voice fractured on the last word. Lily and Ranger moved the shelf together, enough to drag Emma and the chair clear. They turned toward the hallway. The smoke was lower now, noticeably lower than it had been 2 minutes earlier, and the ceiling above the exit groaned once, a single low sound, organic and ominous, and then a section of it gave way, bringing down acoustic tile and metal ceiling framing across the only corridor back to the main exit. Time 11:07 a.m., no way forward, no way back. For a long moment, none of them moved. The collapsed section of ceiling had folded across the hallway behind them, sending a new wave of dense gray, white smoke into the lab, thick enough to sting within 2 breaths. Lily pulled the blazer tight against her face and stepped back. Emma steadied herself low beside her chair, practical and composed in the way of someone used to navigating spaces not built for her. Ranger circled the blockage once, pressed his nose to the debris in quick, evaluating sniffs, then lifted his head and turned away with decisive dismissal. The blocked exit was processed and discarded. He was already searching for another way. Lily recognized this focus. Over 5 years she had learned its shades, the loose attention he gave squirrels, the careful watchfulness he reserved for strangers, and this third kind forward, leaning, total concentration. He crossed the lab at a trot toward the far wall where a metal storage cabinet had shifted. Behind it, nearly erased by layers of old paint, was a narrow service door. Its push bar had rusted to deep orange. It appeared on none of the evacuation maps. Ranger pressed his nose to the bottom gap, inhaled once, then drove his shoulder into it. The door moved a fraction. Lily pushed Emma's chair forward and told her to add her weight. Emma pressed both palms to the bar. Lily threw her shoulder against the edge while Ranger struck the lower panel in steady, methodical impacts. Smoke rose to chest height. The fluorescent light flickered and died. The door groaned, old paint tearing from older metal, and burst open. They stumbled into cold air. Firefighters converged, lifting Emma, pulling Lily clear. But Ranger stopped 15 feet from the door, breathing shallow, sides rising with effort. Lily knelt before him. "Hey, partner, we made it." He licked her hand once, slow and deliberate, then folded gently to the concrete. A paramedic assessed him quickly. "His heart," she said evenly. "Why need a veterinary team now?" Later, the emergency veterinarian would explain he had lived for years with an undiagnosed cardiac weakness, pressure building silently until it could no longer be concealed. The Animal Emergency Center on Prescott Road, 3 miles east of Cedar Ridge, was a low concrete building Lily had never entered before. That afternoon she noticed everything with crisis, sharpened clarity, scuff marks across the linoleum, a faded heartworm poster curling at the corners, the fluorescent light above reception humming at a frequency almost felt more than heard. The veterinary team took Ranger through the back doors within 40 seconds of the stretcher's arrival, moving with swift, purposeful silence. A technician handed Lily a clipboard, owner's name, patient's name, medical history, and she filled it out standing, because sitting felt like surrendering something she refused to surrender. Outside, 2 news vans parked along the parallel street. The story had traveled faster than the smoke. A 13-year-old girl, her dog, a burning building, a wheelchair, a forgotten service door. By the time Lily's mother arrived, white-faced and still wearing her work lanyard, a third van had joined and a reporter stood near the entrance with rehearsed concern. None of it penetrated the waiting room. Inside, only the muffled footsteps behind the treatment doors and the steady ticking clock above the water dispenser mattered. After 40 minutes, Dr. Samir Patel emerged, compact, careful-spoken, wearing composure not as coldness but as steadiness. He explained dilated cardiomyopathy, a gradual weakening of the heart muscle, developing silently over years. Smoke inhalation had stressed a heart already compromised. Ranger was stable for now, but the next 24 hours were critical. 2 possible directions. He named both plainly. Lily's mother stayed beside her through evening into night, hand resting lightly on her arm. Outside, the vans left and the town resumed its ordinary Tuesday, dinners, homework, televisions humming low. Inside, Lily watched the clock and did not sleep. She thought of the auction lawn, of Ranger's slow, assessing look, of mornings before alarms, of the way he leaned against her when sirens passed. She pressed the metal beneath her shirt and held it there. At 20:47 a.m., Dr. Patel returned, tension eased from his face. "He's stabilized," he said. "The immediate crisis has passed." He led her back. Ranger lay on the padded table, breathing slow and even. When she entered, his eyes opened, simply, quietly, the way a door opens when someone long recognized finally comes home. The investigation into the Cedar Ridge cafeteria fire took 11 days. The fire marshal's report, released to the school district on a gray Thursday morning, was 11 pages long and written in the flat, procedural language of official documents, but its central finding was neither flat nor procedural in what it meant for the people connected to it. The fire had originated in the cafeteria's east storage room at approximately 10:51 a.m. on June 3, 12 minutes before the alarm activated in the auditorium. The ignition source was identified as a portable heat coil connected to improvised wiring, assembled for the purpose of an unauthorized electrochemical experiment. The apparatus had been put in place the evening before, during a window when the storage room was left unlocked for an inventory delivery. The student responsible was identified through a combination of physical evidence, security camera footage, and, ultimately, his own account, which he delivered to the school principal and the fire marshal on the morning of the 8th day. Sitting across a wide desk with his hands folded tight in his lap and his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, the way people look when they have been carrying a weight long enough that setting it down has become more frightening than continuing to carry it. His name was Noah Whitman. He was 12 years old, thin across the shoulders, with the kind of face that was still in the early stages of becoming what it would eventually be. He was not a reckless child. His science teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, would describe him later in a conversation that was careful and uncomfortable on both sides as one of the most genuinely curious students she had worked with in 15 years, a boy who read beyond the curriculum, who asked questions during class that took longer to answer than the lesson plan accommodated, who had recently become absorbed by electrochemical reactions after finding a library book on industrial battery design. The experiment itself had not been malicious. It was the product of a 12-year-old's absolute certainty that he could manage something more complex than it actually was, combined with the characteristically 12-year-old failure to account adequately for the possibility of things going wrong. The heat coil had overloaded overnight. The fire had been burning inside the storage room wall for nearly an hour before the smoke reached the cafeteria ventilation system. By the time anyone registered the smell, it had already found its way to the auditorium. Noah had known within the first hour. He had stood in the school parking lot during the evacuation and watched the smoke rising from the east wing and understood, with a certainty that settled into his stomach like cold stone, exactly where it had come from and exactly who had placed it there. He had said nothing that day. He had said nothing for 7 days after it, moving through the relocated school days at the district community center with his hands folded and his expression composed and the weight in his stomach growing heavier with each hour that passed without him speaking. On the 8th morning, he told his parents at breakfast, and his father had the school principal's number dialed within the hour, and by 9:30 a.m. Noah Whitman was sitting in that chair across that desk, setting the weight down at last. The public apology came 2 weeks after the report's release. The school assembled, not under compulsion, not as a disciplinary requirement, but at Noah's own request. Made in a conversation with the principal that surprised her enough to make her ask once whether he understood he was not obligated. He confirmed that he understood. He stood at the same microphone where Lily had been mid-sentence about compassion when the smoke first reached the room, and he spoke for 4 minutes in a voice that wavered on the first sentence and steadied on the second, and he said that he was responsible for what had happened, that he understood the full weight of what it could have become, and that he was sorry, not as a rehearsed formula, but in the specific and effortful way that genuine remorse sounds recognizably different from performed remorse, and most of the people seated in that gymnasium recognized the difference without needing it explained. Emma Rise sat in the front row. When Noah stepped back from the microphone, she reached forward and took his hand, briefly, without words, and that single gesture moved through the assembly hall with more force than anything that had been spoken aloud. Lily stood near the back wall and watched, and afterward she found Noah in the corridor, still pale, still slightly unsteady on his feet, and she said the thing that had been forming in her mind since the first time she heard his name connected to the fire. The mistake started the fire, she told him, her voice level and without judgment. But telling the truth is what starts the healing. Noah looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, the way people nod when something arrives in exactly the place inside them that needed to be reached. The discovery happened in the way that the most significant revelations often do, not in a dramatic moment with an audience assembled for it, but quietly, in a small room between two people who were not prepared for what was about to surface. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, 6 weeks after the fire, and Lily was sitting in the long-term recovery room where Ranger had been transferred, a room with one window looking out onto a gravel service path and a stand of bare October trees, a cardiac monitor on a rolling stand, and a narrow padded examination surface where Ranger lay with his head between his front paws, watching the door with the patient and proprietorial attention of an animal that has decided the room belongs to him. Noah had come at Emma's quiet suggestion. Emma had told him, without making a particular point of it, that Lily had mentioned once that she didn't mind visitors who were comfortable sitting without needing to fill every silence. He had brought a book with him, which he did not open. He sat in the chair near the window and looked at Ranger for a long time without speaking. Then he asked, carefully, what Ranger's breed was, then how old Lily estimated him to be. Then, without any obvious transition between those questions and the next, he asked about Blaze. He had read the county newspaper account of the 2021 auction, the full story, the Paradise Fire connection, the medal around Lily's neck, and something in the article had caught in his memory and refused to be released since the first time he read it. Lily told him what she remembered: the dark coat with amber markings, the rescue collar with the tag printed B7 in faded stencil lettering, the way Blaze had moved through the smoke with a certainty that felt older than his training, the kind that accumulates between a dog and the people who are his over years of ordinary life lived together. Noah was quiet for a long time after she finished. He was looking at the October trees through the window, and his expression was the expression of a person doing interior arithmetic, checking one figure against another, reaching a result, checking it a second time before trusting it. Then he reached into the outer pocket of his backpack and took out his phone and navigated to a photograph, and he held the screen out to Lily without saying anything first. The image was old, shot on a point and shoot camera and later digitized, with the color saturation of photographs from the mid-2010s that gives everything a slightly warmer quality than the present. It showed a backyard somewhere in Northern California, judging from the dry hillside visible beyond the fence, and in the center of the yard a German shepherd puppy was looking directly into the camera with its ears tipped slightly forward, its coat dark smoke layered over amber. Beside the dog, a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6 sat cross-legged in the dry grass with both arms wrapped around the dog's neck, smiling in the completely unguarded way children smile when they are fully happy and have not yet learned to hold anything back for photographs. The boy was Noah. The Whitman family had lived in Paradise, California until 2015. Noah's father had worked in the timber industry. When the company contracted and the financial situation at home became untenable, the family relocated to Willow Creek to begin again. And in the difficult arithmetic of that move, what could be taken, what could not, the dog had been surrendered to a rescue organization operating out of Butte County. His name then had been Bear. The rescue organization had renamed him during intake and placed him in a professional training program, and when the fire moved through Paradise in November 2018, Bear, now named Blaze, had been part of a rapid response search team deployed to assist with civilian evacuation. He was 5 years old. He had been doing precisely the job he was trained and trusted to do. And the girl whose sleeve he had gripped in his teeth inside that burning room, the girl he had pulled into open air before turning and walking back toward the smoke, had been living in the same neighborhood, in the same town, where Noah Whitman had spent the first years of his life. Lily held the phone and looked at the photograph without speaking. Ranger lifted his head from his paws and watched her. The cardiac monitor maintained its slow, steady record of a heart that was still present, still working, still keeping its rhythm. Outside the window, an afternoon wind moved through the bare October branches, and they shifted and resettled. Lily handed the phone back carefully, and she was quiet for a moment because the thing she was holding in her mind was too large and too precise to be rushed into words. Then she said, quietly, "He found me because you loved him first." Noah looked at the photograph in his own hands and said nothing. He did not need to. The guilt that had lived in him since June 3rd had just discovered that it was not the whole of the story, that underneath it, connected to it in a way he could not have constructed or planned, was something else entirely. Something that looked, if you were prepared to look at it directly, like the earliest possible shape of a purpose. June 3, 2027 arrived in Willow Creek the way second anniversaries arrive when the first was survived, not carrying the raw, exposed quality of the original date. But something different, a weight that was softer in some places and harder in others, the accumulated weight of a full year of living with what had happened and deciding, day by day and choice by choice, what to build from it. Ranger moved more slowly now. The cardiomyopathy had not been reversed. It was managed with daily medication, regular monitoring appointments with Dr. Patel, and a schedule considerably quieter than the one he had kept throughout most of his life. He slept in longer stretches. He no longer ran, but he walked with Lily every morning along the path behind the Miller property, his pace deliberate and measured, his nose still working in the same focused, thorough sweeps it always had, as though a shorter route was no less worth investigating carefully than a long one. He had acquired a particular kind of dignity in the years since the fire, the kind that comes to animals and to people alike when they have passed through something that tested the outer limit of what they could endure and discovered that the limit was further out than anyone had estimated. The Safe Experiments initiative had started as Noah's idea, and it had arrived the way his best ideas tended to arrive, not complete, not polished, but as a single observation he could not stop returning to. He brought it first to Mrs. Alvarez during a conversation that had begun about something else entirely. The problem, he said, was specific and structural. The school's science storage room kept no organized inventory of heat-producing equipment. There were no posted standards distinguishing which materials required direct adult supervision from those that did not. The fire safety instruction delivered in science classes addressed the correct response when something went wrong, but said almost nothing about the particular conditions, inadequate ventilation, unsupervised heat sources, improvised wiring, that caused things to go wrong in the first place. Mrs. Alvarez listened to the entire thing without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment across her desk and said, "Write all of that down. Every part of it. Bring it back to me." He returned 3 days later with 7 pages of organized notes, and she read the whole document in front of him, and when she looked up she said it was the strongest proposal for a student-led safety program she had encountered in 20 years of teaching, and that she intended to help him build it into something real. Emma joined the project in the second week, which surprised some people and did not surprise those who had been paying close attention. She brought capacities to the work that Noah genuinely did not have, the practiced experience of moving through institutional spaces designed with barriers embedded in them, an instinct for locating the gaps that formal procedures leave open because the people who wrote them had never needed to navigate the spaces personally, and a particular patient clarity about the difference between what a published policy says and what it actually accomplishes in practice. Working together, they produced a laboratory safety guide written in language accessible to students rather than administrators, specific enough to address the actual conditions that had produced the accident, clear enough to be used rather than filed. The school district's facilities committee reviewed the document in April. In May, Cedar Ridge became the pilot school for a district-wide laboratory review program built on the initiative's framework. The county newspaper ran a piece about it on a Wednesday morning. The headline referred to Emma and Noah as student safety advocates. Neither of them had proposed the term. Neither of them asked to have it changed. Ranger was formally recognized as the school's safety ambassador at a brief ceremony in the Cedar Ridge Gymnasium on the morning of June 3rd, a date Principal Hernandez had chosen with intention, which she acknowledged openly at the start of the ceremony. She told the assembled students and staff that June 3rd would not become a date the school institution moved past as efficiently as possible. It would become a date the school actively returned to each year, to account for what had been learned, and to measure how far that learning had traveled since the last time they stood in this room. Ranger sat at the front of the gymnasium beside Lily, with the composed patience of an animal that has attended enough human gatherings to have developed an accurate sense of how long they last. When Principal Hernandez fastened the embroidered ambassador patch to the vest he now wore for ceremonial appearances, he examined it briefly with his nose, accepted it without ceremony, and looked back out at the room with an expression that several people in the gymnasium independently described afterward, in separate conversations and without comparison, as satisfaction. Lily kept her hand resting on his back through the entire ceremony. She could feel his heart beating steadily through the fabric of the vest, not with the strength it had once carried, but present, unhurried, marking time with a quiet reliability that she had learned, in the years since the fire, never to take as a given. June 3, 2032 fell on a Thursday, warm and clear, with the particular quality of early summer light in central Texas that turns the edges of ordinary things gold and makes the oak leaves look as though each one has been individually considered. Willow Creek Memorial Park occupied 4 acres near the center of town. Old oaks ranged along the perimeter fence, a wide central lawn, a curved stone path leading from the main gate to the small open amphitheater where the town gathered for outdoor events in the warmer months. By 15 a.m. the park held perhaps 200 people, arriving in the unhurried and sociable way that marks events a community has made a genuine habit of returning to. People who knew each other and paused to talk, children cutting across the lawn, while parents found their seats along the stone benches. The Blaze and Ranger Day ceremony had been held here every year since 2022, and it had grown the way things grow when they are genuinely useful to the people who keep coming back to them, not through promotion or organized effort, but through the simple, compounding fact of mattering to the people who attend. Lily was 20 years old. She sat in the front row of the amphitheater in her fire department trainee uniform, the dark fabric still relatively new, the badge at her chest catching the morning light at a clean angle. The uniform had taken 6 years of deliberate forward movement to reach. The volunteer program she had entered at 16, the fire science coursework carried alongside her regular academic schedule. The physical certification she had completed the previous winter on a morning cold enough that her breath had fogged against the inside of her breathing apparatus faceplate. Beneath the uniform shirt she wore the medal, as she had every day since she was 9 years old. The inscription had worn smooth at the edges from years of being pressed between her palm and her sternum in quiet moments, but the words themselves were still fully legible. He went back. Emma sat 2 seats to her left in the green vest of the County Volunteer Paramedic Corps, her certification earned the previous spring, her chair positioned at the accessible end of the row with the easy, automatic precision of someone who has long since stopped consciously accounting for the accommodation. Noah sat at the far end, 21 years old, a fire safety engineering credential in his wallet, and a second-year research project on school building ventilation systems in the folder tucked under his arm. He had not returned to the cafeteria wing of Cedar Ridge in 6 years. He had been back to the school building itself a dozen times, always for the initiative, always with Emma, always on purpose. Ranger lay in the grass to Lily's right, in the shade cast by one of the park's oldest oaks. He was 11 years old, which is a significant number for a German shepherd, and the 11 years had made themselves visible in the gray that had spread from his muzzle across his face and the upper line of his neck, in the pace he maintained now, in the way he settled into rest more completely than he once had. He was not diminished. He was carrying the accumulated weight of his own history in the manner that worthy things carry weight, visibly, without apology, as straightforward evidence of what they have been and what they have done. His cardiac medication had been adjusted 3 times in the past 2 years. Dr. Patal, who still saw him at regular 3-month intervals, had said at the last appointment that Ranger's heart, for everything it had been asked to endure, was still doing what it was asked to do, still present, still marking time. The ceremony was simple and deliberate. 3 short speeches, Principal Hernandez, the county fire marshal, Emma, and a reading of both names and both stories delivered by a Cedar Ridge student who was 8 years old, selected by her own class. When the student spoke Blaze's name, Lily pressed her palm flat against the metal beneath her shirt and held it there without moving. When she spoke Ranger's name, Ranger lifted his head from his resting position and looked toward the amphitheater, and several people watching him from the lawn laughed softly and with genuine warmth, the way people laugh at something that arrives in exactly the right moment and cannot be improved upon. At 10:32 a.m., a siren sounded 2 blocks to the east, a fire engine moving along the main road toward an intersection and then continuing north, carrying its urgency in the direction it was needed. The sound lasted perhaps 15 seconds, swelling as it passed and then fading as the distance absorbed it. Ranger did not press against anyone's legs. He did not stiffen. He did not search the perimeter with his eyes the way he once had. He turned his head toward the sound and listened to it with calm, complete attention until it was gone, and then he looked at Lily in the same unhurried, measuring way he had looked at her on the auction lawn 11 years earlier. The same assessment, the same recognition, the same conclusion arrived at quietly and without ceremony, and she held his eyes and did not look away. When he lowered his head back to his paws and closed his eyes, he did it with the total and untroubled stillness of an animal that has completed everything it came to do and is at peace with the fact of it. The siren's last echo dissolved into the warm morning air above the park. It did not carry the sound of warning. It did not carry the sound of fear. It carried, in the silence it left behind, the final note of something that had always been, underneath every hard thing that had happened inside it. A story about loyalty finding its way home and staying there. If this story stayed with you, if Ranger's loyalty meant something real to you, then this channel is for people who still believe stories can change us. Subscribe not just to watch, but to be part of the next story that might stay with you forever. And if you know someone who would feel this the way you did, share it with them.